There's another big show out right now that tried the same kind of thing as A League of Their Own, and a lot of people hated it. I am talking about Rings of Power, that very expensive Lord of the Rings prequel, also on Amazon Prime Video.
Our ancestors were not given anything. They paid for this isle with the blood of their kin.
What the elf means.
Then if blood be the price of passage, I will pay it.
People truly got upset about black hobbits. So upset that the cast and crew of this show have had to publicly denounce Middle-earth racism. This is wild to me, but also not unexpected. People are mad about characters of color in Star Wars. They are mad about characters of color in the Game of Thrones prequel. There are even grown adults upset that Ariel is black in the new Little Mermaid.
Wish I could be part of that world.
What gives? Well, to find out, we posed this question to a PhD who studies fantasy writing. She actually studies how people of color are portrayed in fantasy. I know, very cool job.
Oh my goodness, grown men are suddenly worried about a mermaid.
Her name is Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, and she says people get so mad about this stuff because most, if not all, of the fantasy writing in the Western world, it is deeply entrenched in whiteness. And whiteness not just as the default, but whiteness as the ideal.
The only way that the European powers, kingdoms, and empires could ever stop trying to eradicate each other was to set themselves up as an entity against the rest of the world, the West versus the rest. And we certainly see that play out in a number of fantasy narratives, particularly modern fantasy.
Dr. Thomas says whiteness is so entrenched in Western fantasy that when a black character just shows up, it's shocking.
It's the black person sitting up being a knight or a mermaid that causes the hesitation. It's as much as the flutter of a dragon's wing or fairy dust. It's that profound.
I asked Dr. Thomas if this will ever change and how to watch shows like Rings of Power in spite of all those racial dynamics. But first, I had her explain to me very clearly just which hobbits and orcs and dwarves and elves got a race change.
There are actually 4 darker-skinned characters. I think there are other actors of color who are doing a superb job, but there are 4 in particular in The Lord of the Rings of Power, who have been objected to. I think most of the objections have been against Arondir, who is the black elf.
And be grateful that you need never see them again.
He's one of the immortal elves of Tolkien's Legendarium. Mm-hmm. Then we have Disa, who is one of the dwarf characters.
Sing to it properly. Each of those parts will reflect your song back to you, telling you its story, showing you what might be hidden, where to mine, where to tunnel, and where to leave the mountain untouched.
Queen Miriel of Numenor is also played by an actress of color. And I do think that beauty and desirability, racial politics will come into play in discussions there. And then finally, we have Sadok, who is one of the Harfoot characters. So the Harfoots are the predecessors of the hobbit culture. So, so because the...
Wait, so the hobbit's like great-granddaddy is black now?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, come on. Okay. Talk about it. I like that.
Yes. Because Tolkien says in the Legendarium that Sam Gamgee was browner. And of course, there have been people talking about that. Yeah. There's been pushback saying, oh, no, we meant browner as in tanned. I tweeted about this a couple of weeks ago. When I was a kid, every time I read a character being tall, dark, and handsome, I imagined Michael Jordan.
They didn't mean black.
Right, I thought that was Michael Jordan, right?
They've been Ben Affleck. They've been Ben Affleck. Dark hair.
And then you're like, dark where? Like, that's not dark to us. So it's so interesting to think about the difference in perception. I mean, Black audiences supported Game of Thrones. We're huge nerds. People of color are huge nerds. So we have seen and viewed and read so much that did not include us. And then finally, at this late date, we finally show up and we're not even the majority.
But do any of the critiques from these loud and angry and, in my opinion, racist Lord of the Rings fans make sense to you at all when we unpack the history of all Western fantasy? If Western fantasy is rooted in whiteness, aspirational whiteness, isn't it a reader of these books and now a viewer of these shows, aren't they in some regard actually right in saying, I am shocked to see people who didn't look like they did in the books? This actually bucks up against one of the central organizing principles of Western fantasy work. Is that ever, in your opinion, a valid critique of some of these castings?
I wouldn't call it a valid critique, but I have sympathy, and I know it's coming from an ingrained power structure who themselves have been carefully taught to see the world as white and heroic and dark and savage. That was how they were taught. However, that does mean we have an obligation as a society to begin to unlearn, right? So this is the very beginning of this.
But this is the thing. Who wants to go watch a fun fantasy show to unlearn anything? I'm going to this thing to be comforted and to almost be reassured that the fantasies of my youth still feel good and knowable to me. You know what I'm saying?
Right. I hear you. But my question about that perspective is this. What about these four characters? What is it about these four characters that makes you feel uncomfortable? They are saying the words from the script that, we can argue, right, that we can argue are or are not like Tolkien, right? We can say, okay, this, because they didn't have the rights to the Silmarillion and to many of the other previous, or many of the other Lord of the Rings and Hobbit prequel works. So, I mean, we could quibble with the writing. We can quibble with the plot. We can quibble with the production. I think it is magnificent to see how they have chosen to adapt material that many experts previously said was not adaptable because of the expanse of Tolkien's imagination and language building. Instead of having those conversations, the idea that seeing people with darker skin interrupts the fantastic dream is something that must constantly be pushed back against, because if we're erased in the imagination, then it is easier to erase us in the real world, because the imagination is the seed. It's where racist ideas are seeded.
Well, so then, okay. The next question I have for you, as someone who spent a few days now trying to figure this out myself, was the source material and was Tolkien himself racist or not? I know that's way too simple of a question, but let's try to answer it. Because in his personal life, he seemed to denounce racism, denounce anti-Semitism. He spoke out vocally against apartheid in South Africa. But a lot of his work, most of his work, has this very detailed racial coding in which race is objectively real, different races and species of these, creatures that exist. So by the standards of his time, was he in his writing progressive on race, regressive on race, or something else?
It's complicated. If you were to twist my arm and to ask me, if I could only have 10 books to take with me for the rest of my life, what are the 10? And I mean, I have all kinds of authors. I have James Baldwin's If Beale Street Could Talk on that list, but also the Silmarillion. I loved the prose. I loved the myth building. It seemed epic. It seemed grand. However, I would agree that Tolkien was a man of his time because for all that he was progressive liberal for the standards of that time,
Yeah.
he could have been a mentor of one of the greatest Black academics of the 20th century and refused him, Stuart Hall.
Oh, really?
Yes, the great British Jamaican sociologist. He went to Tolkien and he recounts that he was rebuffed. Tolkien did not think that he had promise. And that was heartbreaking to me as a Black professor. And to know that, wow, you really did not see me as part of your audience. And if I had come to you, certainly as a Black woman, and, with my love and interest in British literature, especially when I was younger, you would not have seen me. You probably would not have wanted to work with me. It's chilling to know that I see you, but you don't see me. And so I think that's my response to whether he was racist or not.
Yeah, yeah. We know that he had races of species and used the word race to talk about these different kinds of creatures, and they were racially coded. Is it fair to say the source material itself and the way that it classified racial categories, that's racist? That is racist? Because it's like, I'll go online and
absolutely.
Google,
Yes.
was Tolkien racist
absolutely.
or no? And it's like, no, that was kind of racist. Okay.
Yes. I can say an unequivocal yes. Like the people of Harad and Far Harad and Rune, the Easterlings, they're susceptible to evil in ways that the characters who are coded white aren't.
So you mentioned at the top of this chat that kind of all of Western fantasy work is kind of rooted in these ideas of whiteness being good and darkness or blackness being bad. Is that the way fantasy goes all across the world? Or do fantasy genres and writers and cultures outside of the UK and America do it differently?
They absolutely do it differently. We have so many young first generation African millennials all over the world who are just publishing incredible fantasy stories right now. Tomi Adeyemi, Roseanne Brown. We have Indigenous and First Nations people. So there's Sherry DeMoline's The Marrow Thieves, which won every single award in my neck of the woods in children's and young adult literature. And then finally, Latin America is magical realism. We have magical realism. Yes, yes. So we have all that. In the Caribbean, I mean, we could just shout out Pacifica. I mean, everybody else does their own thing.
This is the thing. All right, so if everybody else does their own thing, if there's a whole wide world of fantasy that is not just Western white-focused fantasy, if it is 2022 and the entire world is connected through the internet, why are so many fantasy worlds in America and the UK still white? Why are they still relying on that old model of fantasy writing and fantasy conceptualization when so much else exists? And it seems as if we're in a time where everything can be changed, because why not?
My answer to that is a viral meme from a brother from Louisiana. Let's go where the money resides, where the bunny resides. Follow the money. We have to follow the money. So people may have the best of intentions when it comes to diversity, multiculturalism, and sharing space. But money and power rule this world and humanity, unfortunately. So you can have every good intention to adapt work from the global South and from the rest of us in the West. However, when you do that, how many Jordan Peels are you going to allow? And then there are less slots, less spots, and less money for your friends to create their own multi-million-dollar projects. But when it comes down to it, sharing space means actually giving up something that you've always had. So it means giving up power, giving up the spotlight,
and giving up money.
giving up money so that you can share that space. And there's, that's hard for folks.
It's hard. Well, and like, this is a thing I'm noticing that's even bigger than, does the Hobbit get to be black? It's who is getting the major billion-dollar deals to make things like Rings of Power or the Game of Thrones prequel. It's usually white guys still working with fantasy based in whiteness. Right. And so at some point, the debate over the Black Hobbit is secondary to the larger issue of who's getting the money and the big budgets to imagine whatever kind of world on a screen. And will we ever see a world in which the billion-dollar mega-wattage deal to make a fantasy show goes to a black or brown or anything else fantasy writer? Do you see that happening soon?
I actually think that the debates about these singular or black characters or handful of characters of color in mostly white mainstream fantasy, science fiction, comics, I don't think that it's secondary to the debate of whether we get our shows or more Black Panthers, more Get Outs. Here's why. Let me tell you why. Because they see so much protest every single time that a character of color is cast in these $100 million, $500 million productions. They see this, and they is the powers that be, producers, people who have capital, people who fund these productions. They see this. At the end of the day, some of these people are not so much invested in race as they are in the color green. And so they feel that if you're going to have only a certain part of the audience who will go and turn out to see it, which is why Black audiences in particular, we have been not only loyal, but almost obsessed with, we have got to turn out and make this a success. Because as someone told me 20 years ago when I was trying to publish a fantasy with a Black boy character, a Black boy main character, they told me this: Ebony, you think that you're going to get both Black readers and you're going to get fantasy readers. I disagree. You're going to get Black people who read fantasy. That mentality still prevails. And a lot of the audience, and I can't just say the white audience, a lot of the audience will tune out because of the way they have been carefully taught to view fantasy, science fiction, comics, and all of the imaginative, dreaming genres.
Yeah. How should one watch Rings of Power, given all this baggage? A viewer who says, I see this backlash, it feels kind of weird. Hearing you now talk about how most of Western fantasy is grounded in whiteness, that makes me feel kind of weird too. How do you watch a show like Rings of Power and still just enjoy it in spite of all of that, in spite of the baggage? How do you do it?
I think that you can enjoy it, but it needs to be tempered with other kinds of fantasy. I would encourage people to read and view widely. There has never been a time, never, that we have had so many different imaginative visions of what magic and wonderment and enchantment could look like. Science fiction and fantasy magazines to books, publishing. Finally, the dam has broken and everyone's publishing now. May it continue. May it continue.
The next time I have you on the show, we're going to talk about how one of those Black hobbits on this little Amazon show has a nice, tight, clean fade for a haircut. Is there a Black barber in Middle-earth? I need to have that explained. That's a different conversation. You know what I'm talking about. He got a nice tight fade.
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about.
Right. Yes, I hear you now. I hear
so
the hair is
that's
good.
Our next chat.
Yes,
that's our next chat. Who's doing the hair in Middle-earth? Thanks again to Associate Professor Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. She is based at the University of Michigan. Also, go check out her book on all this stuff. It is called The Dark Fantastic: Race and the Imagination. From Harry Potter to the Hunger Games.